population unable to afford a healthy diet. And you can see in terms of the patterns of color that, yes, there's clearly an inverse pattern there in terms of obesity and in terms of stunting, but you can see that it also matches up with a number of components of the other ones. And I think, and particularly the worrying one of the more worrying ones for many countries, but particularly Africa, is the affordability of a healthy diet. Because even if the diet is available, if it's not affordable, people can't benefit from it. So really, that was just a relatively short section as an update about where we are in terms of all of these different metrics and what the trends are. And generally speaking, I mean, the trends are relatively positive, certainly in terms of stunting, in terms of some of the other factors to do with nutrition. But obviously, there's still quite a long way to go with those. So one of the things that was done in 2019 was really to try to look at all of the problems facing humanity and to break it down into a series of goals. So the millennial goals, by and large, some were met, some were not. But the sustainability development goals are really the ones that will be seen as the key, and they'll be assessed in 2030. And they go from a whole range of different components. And the idea is that each of those components contributes and helps to develop a focus on particular targets. So things like goal one is no poverty, goal two, zero hunger, goal three, good health and well-being, and so on. And this is really the system that if you like, the international community uses for assessing whether things are moving forward or how much things are moving forward. And the final assessment will occur in 2030. And the chances are that some of it may make good progress, but it's very unlikely that we'll manage to match everything and complete everything. Please ignore the noise in the background. It's a cat having a go at the sofa. But I think there will be progress in some areas. It's also fair to say that when these were set in Paris in 2015, they were very ambitious and they were deliberately ambitious in a way that realistically it was unlikely everything would be met. Now, let me talk a little about the CGIAR. I don't know how many of you are from, have worked in the CGIAR or work with the CGIAR. And in particular, just to talk a little bit about the new science programs. So the idea of treating things holistically is really how CGIAR has developed. So to begin with, CGIAR, the initial institutes were focused very much about crop breeding. And they were, generally speaking, quite successful about the crop breeding side of things. But the problem was it wasn't really making the sort of impact that was expected. And I think as things have moved forward, there's more and more understanding of you need integration and you need an understanding, not just in terms of the science of breeding, but also, how do seed systems work? Particularly, how do seed systems work when there's no industry involved? So if you're dealing with inbreds, industry is not really that interested because they don't make money out of it, because farmers can basically just keep growing the same seed. So how do you make that crop? How do you make that available? So particularly in terms of legumes, which are key parts of any sort of holistic system, most of the legumes, not all of the legumes, but most of the legumes are still inbred lines. There's some very interesting work in India, in particular in terms of pigeon pea, which has a hybrid system and which hopefully in the very near future, a number of hybrids should come out, which should make quite a big impact, hopefully, in terms of pigeon pea production, but also the systems they work in. So I'll talk a bit more about the breeding for tomorrow in a sec, but you can see from the other areas, the other science programs, so sustainable farming focuses very much in terms of, okay, you have the varieties And how do you grow those varieties? What systems do you grow them in? What do you need to know about the systems? And how do you actually develop those systems with the agronomy and management so that they're sustainable, but also that they're productive? Because if they're not productive, it's not going to help. And animal and aquatic food is a similar sort of idea. But landscapes are also multifunctional. They're used for many things, not just growing food, but obviously things like carbon capture, eco services. There is a specific focus on better diets and nutrition, which I think is an important component of that. So to make sure that what breeding does actually has an impact in terms of making people well. Obviously, climate action, agriculture accounts for quite a bit. Global agriculture accounts for quite a bit of CO2 emissions, and it's important, particularly, and also obviously NOx emissions. So it's important that any progress that's made is not undone by some of those current treatments. And then policy innovations in terms of, well, why don't things move forward? Well, if you're providing free fertilizer to farmers, they don't have an incentive not to use lots of free fertilizer. So I think understanding policies that work is really one of the critical things of making actual impact. And obviously, food frontiers and food security are clearly components which are really important. That's supported by what are termed accelerators. So gender equality and inclusion, digital transformation, capacity sharing, and also the gene banks where the accessions of the crops are held. And the aim is to really work through those as research programs to look at what can be done and provide examples. And then it's a different job in terms of scaling. That should really sit with developmental organizations because they have the capacity to do it. But all of those should contribute to five areas which have been identified. And those five areas essentially feed into the SDGs. This is Breeding for Tomorrow, which is focused on the actual breeding component of that. And really, all I want to show is that the way this has been addressed, and it may be something you do a standard within your own work, is to work out what you're trying to achieve and then work backwards in terms of what are the constraints on that, what could be done, what could be investigated to understand how best to address that, rather than I have a gene which I know in Arabidopsis does X, Y, and Z. Let's just push it through everything and see what happens. Because again, the complexity that actually comes in later often means that these things don't translate. So working from the opposite end in some ways is good. The second column there, which is really the current uh, breeding for tomorrow, is really where the main focus is. So market intelligence is really its aim is to go back and understand what farmers want, what processors want, what characteristics need to be bred into breeding programs. And to some extent that's working. It's not in any sense perfect. Um, I mean, this is the whole thing about demand-led breeding programs. So you really are responding to a demand. But it's also true that if you're responding to a demand from, say, farmers, that demand may be different to the demand from processors. There may also be things that basically the scientists are aware of in terms of, say, heat tolerance or other tolerances, where there is no demand being heard from the downstream, but it needs to be in there. So all of this needs to be brought together and it needs to be put into the breeding framework. The one at the bottom is actually really just in terms of the linearity of that. I mean, so this is the old version, which basically says the same thing. So you design a product, you identify when you need to look for new genes or new traits, and you identify those and deliver them. That goes into the breeding pipelines. And then the breeding pipelines will develop products that the product delivery, in this case, seed systems, will provide to farmers. But the main difference in between the two is that the top one is now circular. And I think that's really also extremely important, is that in many ways the seed system people, they have a very good idea of what people want. And I think that really would benefit with them being much more involved in saying, yes, this product should go forward or that product should go forward. And then obviously there needs to be some way of showing what's happening. So this is just a snap of the CGIAR dashboard, which gives some idea of what's happening, how many actions, how many places, where they are. And you can drill down into this and get some idea of individual projects. Um, any sort of reporting process is going to involve sort of subjective decisions to some extent. And I think one of the key things is really to prevent things getting too subjective, it needs to be agreed by everyone and it needs to be understood what these things mean. And I think that's still an area where there is a lot of scope for improvement because it's quite hard again to, I've got a transgenic plant. How does that compare in terms of impact to having a new variety? And these things are, again, there's a subjective level there. But the more it can be kept objective and the more it can be tied to specific results, the more useful and the more meaningful it is. So what I'll do is really just say a little bit about some of the underutilized crops and really some of the background, and then talk a bit about what has happened over the last 20 odd years in terms of one of those crops. So University of Nottingham in UK and Malaysia and Crops for Future in Malaysia and UK have been working on a number of what you would call minor crops. I wouldn't call them completely underutilized crops. Really, not because they're underutilized per se, but because most of them have special traits. So particularly things like Bambara groundnut has very, very good drought tolerance. Some things like wing bean have very high protein levels. And these things are things that are still grown. They're still grown by communities. They haven't vanished, but they haven't also gone forward to that sort of status of being used at higher levels. At ICRISAT, I mean, obviously ICRISAT works at quite a high volume, but it's not working on those first four crops, the major crops. So sorghum, pearl millet, finger millet, chickpea, pigeon pea, groundnut, and then the minor millets. All of these are really potentially very, very useful crops. The first six are the ones that have the main mandates, and clearly in something like pearl millet or sorghum, they're used in millions of hectares. But also the minor millets and potentially some other more minor legumes potentially give you new options. And I think one of the things that's important is to really to have options. So I mean, if you're growing rice and for whatever reason you miss the planting time, or say wheat and you miss the planting time because of weather, what can you grow? What are your options? And something like, say, Proso millet, which can complete its life cycle in about 60 days, is an option as a secondary crop, as well as having its own characteristics. And many of the minor crops still have good nutritional content. More recently, you may have come across the VAX. So VAX breeding, VAX is a whole investment originally by US State Department in looking at initially African underutilized crops. And that includes finger millet, Bambara groundnut, sesame, pigeon pea, as some of the obvious overlaps in terms of India. And the idea was very much to try and develop those as taken to the next level of crop. And it's initially started in Africa. The focus was Africa, but it's been widened, or it was widening. And it's particularly focused on things that have good nutrition. So this is the first time, perhaps, that there's been a program that is primarily focused around nutrition as well as climate resilience. And seven crops in terms of the breeding component have been funded or were funded, and hopefully those will move forward still. Obviously, USAID being closed down is an issue in terms of funding. So US pulled out of funding for this a while ago. However, FCDO in the UK have agreed to at least one more year's funding, and hopefully they'll do the next year after that. And I think it's way past time that we should be looking at these underutilized crops or more minor crops because it gives us so many more options. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and I might skip a few slides, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Bambara groundnut and the history that I'm aware of, because I think it helps illustrate that these things are not, well, these things are not simple, which is perhaps not surprising, but they're not, it's quite hard to keep consistent effort going in something. And I think that's a problem with the way that a lot of funding happens, particularly in terms of sort of academic funding. But it's important that we find ways to keep things going because in the end, these are some of the crops that will become important, not necessarily everywhere, but they will become important in some systems. So I'm going to talk about a sort of Nottingham-focused background, simply because that's where I come from. But there have been a large number of people involved in many of the projects from different countries and different continents. And really to say how some of the research has developed. So the original research in Nottingham on Bambara groundnut came about in, I think it was 1989, when a set of tropical glass houses, which were there for 10 or 15 years, became available. And Professor Saeed Azam Ali basically just asked colleagues from Africa, what crops do you have that might be of interest to research? And he received some Bambara groundnut, and that's really how things started. The first real funding came in 2000, basically an EU framework program, which included Botswana, Namibia, Swaziland, Germany, and UK. And it was an initial attempt to sort of identify idiotypes. So what is it farmers want? To start to characterize genetic and agronomic performance in different field conditions, to start the genetic diversity analysis, and to start breeding. One of the problems with Bambara groundnut is it has very small flowers. And because of that, there was no crossbreeding. There was no controlled breeding. So the first program ran for 3 years, and it managed to achieve a number of things, one of which was actually the first crosses. So, and a controlled crossing mechanism or method, including crosses to wild species. So particularly the VSSP11 parent is spreading, whereas most of the land races that farmers use are actually bunched. And you could see the segregation in the offspring from that. So it's a very simple control, but it's quite useful to know that. But also starting to cross between genetically diverse, genetically wide material. And this is back in sort of 2003, 2004, when molecular markers were still fairly basic. So some rapid work was done. A little bit of AFLP was done quite early on in collaboration with Keygene. And that allowed some understanding of what the material is. And effectively, if you look at a particular accession, and this is true of the material in the gene bank, it's a mix of inbred lines. And in this case, they identified 3 to 8 similar genotypes per landrace. So it's not pure, which gives you your first problem, particularly if you're wanting to do crossing or if you wanted to do genetics. The second program tried to take this further. So again, this is an EU Framework 6 with Nottingham, colleagues in Denmark and Germany, some of the same colleagues in Africa, but also bringing in India. So National Research Centre for Groundnut, UAS, and also CASRI. And the idea again was to start understanding a little bit more about this crop, take some of the genetic side of things forward. I'll talk only really about the genetic side of things, but I've got some of the reports available if anyone's interested in the other side. So mapping, developing that consistent ability to map and starting to develop SSRs. Initially, these were attempted at cross species, and in most cases they worked as primers, but they didn't detect variation. And that's presumably because the microsatellite hadn't actually evolved in that species after separation. So it's an interesting one, but certainly SSRs are relatively straightforward to pull out. And it was possible to actually develop some QC markers that could be used on agarose. One of the things that Bambara is known for is its photoperiod sensitivity. And this is in some of the lines, it's quite a weird one in that it's to do with pod development. So generally speaking, with a few exceptions, flowering time is not affected. It's actually whether the pod fills or not. So you can see here we've got 3 different genotypes and 3 different day lengths. And for some of them, like the Angpar 4, you can only see pods at 12. And we've played around with Angpar 4 for many years. We've only ever had 1 pod at long photoperiod. So it's absolutely consistent. It does not develop pods at that longer photoperiods. Uniswar develops some at 14, but none at 16. And then Dipsy will develop pods at all of those. What will change is that at 16 hours, the maturity is delayed. So you actually end up with more pods, but it takes longer time to get them. And given that we're the product, if you like, from Bambara groundnut is a seed, understanding this is really important in terms of how do we identify material that potentially doesn't have this effect, or to some extent, how do we use the photoperiod effect when we start moving away from the equator or we start changing the timing of planting. The third part of it really was, again, a development, an international development, really. So Crops for the Future is formed from a merger of the International Centre for Underutilised Crops and the Global Facilitation Unit. And basically, they held an open call and awarded it to University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and Biodiversity Pacific Office. And then and the lead on this was Syed Azam Ali, and he managed to persuade the Malaysian government to provide funding for a research centre. And since that project has finished, we've also established a UK small company, really just as a way to carry on the data legacy of that. So labs under construction just outside of Kuala Lumpur. And one of the things that we did have was a really significant doctoral training program. So we had about 50 students, the majority of them PhD students, working on different aspects of minor crops, all the way from genomics through to product development, really as a way to try to understand and put together practice of how do we develop those value chains and where does the research sit and where are the gaps. By this point, genetic markers had obviously moved on quite a lot. So after we initially set up the DART data race with Kilian in Australia, but obviously when DART-seq markers were developed, it became possible to actually generate large numbers of sequence-tagged markers. We also identified a number of core sets of material which represent a lot of the variability as a way of really trying to distribute them to different programs and different projects so that there's some consistency in terms of the material that different groups work on. And that led us to develop a series of crosses from these parents. There are a few more now as well, at various stages of inbreeding. As well, by taking seed from a single plant, because Bambara is very inbreeding, but if you collect accessions, then you end up with a mix of genotypes because of a landrace structure. By taking seed from a single plant, effectively you have a pure line. So from that, we were able to develop pure line, essentially an association panel, which has been genotyped with DartSeq. But we looked at some of the other sort of fundamental things like floral biology. We looked at water inhibition and uptake. So it's clear that Bambara is much more resistant to water uptake in terms of increasing cooking time, but also that there's genetic variation for that between different genotypes. And then one of the main focuses was in terms of investigating why Bambara groundnut was drought tolerant. And a clear part of that seems to be it is very good at penetrating and getting very deep into the soil. And we could map components of that. And again, as in the same way for wheat, really, where wheat's one of the key things in terms of both nitrogen and water uptake is having root density at depth. And Bambara seems to have a very similar mechanism. And then genetically, again, with the DartSeq, it became possible to really start looking at the genetic variation and where it was distributed. And it's fairly clear that there's a fairly clear split between the two areas, West Africa and Southern and Eastern Africa, in terms of the genetic diversity. In addition, Bambara groundnut is actually found in Indonesia, which is not an obvious one. And we looked at that material and it's incredibly narrow. So we're fairly convinced it's come from probably Tanzania, but it's come as a single packet of seed probably. So all of the variability that Indonesia is trying to work with in terms of breeding only comes from that. But because we had sequence tags as well, it then becomes possible to actually start doing comparisons, so cross-mapping using sequence tags onto genomes that had already been developed. And that started to become extremely useful because I think, again, one of the key things that you struggle with minor crops is if they don't have close relations or relatives, it becomes quite difficult to develop enough critical mass, both in terms of research, but also in terms of data. If you can basically use a related genome as part of what you're trying to do, and as more and more genomes are sequenced, more and more will be available. So effectively, you're working on a complex of genomes. And that means you can translate information, or at least try to translate information on where critical genes are and where you would expect them to be. And that also allowed some synthetic work, really looking at how Bambara stacks up against other genomes, and certainly cowpea is the closest. And again, you can do that on a number of levels. In 2018, the African Orphan Crops Consortium group basically published 5 initial genomes, including Bambara groundnut, which really moved things forward. We're also working, or we have been working, to try to improve that genome assembly, and we should be fairly close soon in terms of having a chromosome level assembly. We have something pretty close at the moment, and I think that will also help not only in Bambara, but potentially in other crops. And resequencing, some initial resequencing data was done during that project. So we're starting to get to a point where we have that sort of initial core of material that can be used and potentially can directly look in terms of genes. One thing just to say before we go too far, in terms of trying to make comparisons between crops, it's one of the problems that you have is effectively what's known as ontologies. So if I'm measuring an internode in cowpea and I'm comparing it to an internode in Bambara groundnut, am I actually measuring the same thing? So ontologies try to help define a language which means the same thing in different cases. And this is important both for phenotyping, but particularly in terms of things like, nutritional values. You need to have an agreed format in terms of a nutritional value, how it's assessed, but also what it means. And I think that's one of the areas where having more controlled ontologies so that we can make comparisons between, say, Bambara groundnut and soybean, and we can understand potentially how manufacturers might be able to use might be able to use the Bambara groundnut as a partial complete substitute for soybean for certain uses. Because in the end, if there's no demand for the crop or there's no big demand for a crop, it's really very, very difficult to actually get things to move. So looking at substitution is probably one of the key things in terms of diversification and making agriculture more holistic to some extent. Future View Beacon. So this was something actually funded by University of Nottingham directly. And there are a number of things in there in terms of minor crops, but one of the things it did was allow us to provide some support to African partners for Bambara for varietal registration, and that process is going on. And hopefully there will be registration next year in at least one country, because at the moment there are no registered varieties, which are certainly pure registered varieties. And also taking the photoperiod question a little bit further and trying to understand a bit more about what the implications are and how we work with it. And for all of these things, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we're really dealing with or really working with a network of partners. So this is for one of the projects we had from the Crop Trust, where we're working with a whole series of partners in a whole range of different areas, really as a way to try to pull together enough effort to make things work. And I think that would be one of my consistent themes in terms of trying to do these things is I mean, I know standard academic approach is competitive because that's the way the funding is provided. But the problem is it's not for something like minor crops. There isn't enough funding to be competitive. And it will only really work if everybody works together. And I think that would be my take-home message in something like minor crops, is there simply isn't the industry backing at this point in time to provide enough money to make these work. So any money that comes in really has to be used in a way that is cooperative. And a few various other things that we did at the time in terms of knowledge systems, but also developing databases. CropBase is quite interesting. It's a first pass suitability mapping for underutilized crops. And it has about 1,600 crops in it. But obviously modeling, so one of the things that came from AppSim modeling in South Africa was actually it's likely that Bambara yields will increase in the next 50 years. So being able to know where a crop can be grown and what sort of yields you might expect, obviously quite important. The other thing which very little is done about, as far as I can see at the moment, is trying to look at more complex agricultural systems. So if we're talking about holistic, then we can't just be talking about monoculture. And I think, and obviously in India, it's a little bit different anyway, because you tend to relay crop as much as anything else. But equally, the resilience within a cropping system depends upon the components. So if you're growing a monoculture, the years that you're lucky, and the years you're not lucky, it tends to fall apart. But there's no reason why you can't stabilize yields by having different components. So some years a component may do well, some years it may do less well. But if those components together produce a nutritious combination, then that may be one way of dealing with the uncertainty which, I mean, everyone is facing in terms of climate change. And one of the things we did do during that time was work with a small company which has since gone on to produce Bambara groundnut noodles as well as Bambara groundnut milk, which are proving quite popular in the States as well as Southeast Asia. Just a few of the people. I mean, this isn't in no sense everyone, but certainly one of the themes of this series is in terms of education. So the first five on there were all PhD students and then became postdocs. And that's really, the work that's been done has been done largely by PhD students and occasionally postdocs. And I think that's really one of the important things again is as things move forward, it requires people who pick up new ideas and develop new approaches. And I think that's really the educational side of it, certainly in terms of training, is the thing that will make the difference between us surviving the next 50 years or not surviving the next 50 years. And it's something that really, really has to be invested in at high level. Um, but it's a very, very good way to have people who think about things in slightly different ways. So a lot of the time, we've also tried to make sure that they're involved in a broader area as well as being involved purely in terms of their direct research. And a lot of the work that has been done here has been done in collaboration and co-led by Festo Masawe, who's based in Malaysia. Just to finish, I was just going to say a little bit about where we are now with Bambara and where I think we need to move. So recently, a number of organizations have become interested in Bambara. The Kirkhouse Trust, which is a small organization in UK, has set up a Bambara breeding initiative, so involving people primarily in Africa, although one of the components is actually to take material from the databases, from the gene banks, and also from material developed in Nottingham, and to grow it in India. So the National Gene Bank and Kuldeep Tripathi and Prem Mother, they're involved in actually trialing this crop for India. And some of the initial results look quite promising. It looks like it should do well in the drier East Coast, particularly where you've got quite sandy soils. So it will be interesting to see how that moves forward, but it also means there's a direct link with Africa to India on this one. Grow Further, which is actually an American organization, is basically also working with Ghana to really move material through to commercialization. Plant Breeders Without Borders, which is a small organization partly supported by Bayer through a grant trust for a grant, has set up a couple of community-based breeding programs. small amounts of money, but over longer times. And that is leading to, or should lead to, release of varieties in Indonesia and Tanzania. And those five projects all have slightly different aims. So there's also a UK CGIAR project, which is very much focused around research, and that really is looking at developing some capacity, so particularly things like speed breeding and gene editing. There's the BBI, which is Kirkhouse. There's the VAX, which I've mentioned already. There's Plant Breeders Without Borders, and there's Vegana Boosting Food Security. The difficulty is that these things are not intrinsically connected, if you like. And that's one of the things that talking to lead on most of these, the community is very much agreed with. What we need is we need to be able to link things together because the individual projects are time limited. In many cases, they're not a huge amount of money. And there's a danger that we just end up endlessly going back and never going forward because, you know, as the universities work in particular, you run out of funding and you go into a different project, and everything can get lost. Some of the things I've mentioned before, it's one of the things we do is complete the genome, plus also we're going to be doing hopefully about 300 resequencings, and that's coming from that whole group. So the aim is to try to pull together information and material from all of those so that hopefully we can get a core material set which can be used really to build links between all of these projects. Um, Kirkhouse is quite useful in many ways because it does have limited funding, um, but it does work long term. So one of the things that we can do is we can match up short-term projects with longer term projects, and particularly Kirkhouse training, Kirkhouse money, to keep some of those long-term community data and protocol resources to keep them alive, to keep it going, because it will be that who has got money for it will change. It will be that sometimes there may be no money at all, but we have to maintain the resources and we have to maintain the knowledge because otherwise we lose out each time. And this is a problem for minor crops. My overall conclusions, just to finish off, I'm not in any sense anti green revolution monoculture where it works and where it's sustainable. I mean, there's some questions about how you need to modify that for it to be sustainable. But where it works, it's very productive and it really underpins the food system. There are many cases and many areas where that may not be possible. And I think that's where we do need a more holistic approach. Where it works, it's fine, but where it doesn't work, we really need to do something that is sustainable. And clearly, the major crops are very water and input hungry. Um, so we really need to be thinking more in terms of how farmers work, more in terms of how systems work. So yes, a monoculture where we control everything, we give it everything it needs. Yes, it's very productive in some years if it's in the right location. But there are many, many other systems which won't be productive in the same way. So I think we need a gradation of different approaches to agriculture, including those where we're using crops which may be very drought tolerant or may be very highly nutritious, which the focus is not so much on the yield, the focus is on what we get from them, or if you like, even the economics. So if we're working with highly tolerant crops, they won't need the inputs even if the inputs are available. So it makes it cheaper to produce. Water is going to be one of the biggest ones, certainly in a number of areas where the aquifers are being used way beyond what's possible to recharge. Heat, which will couple with drought, again, I think heat is the most challenging one. Some crops like pearl millet, they can germinate at high temperatures and they are remarkably stable in terms of production under quite heat stress conditions. Others are not. And I think we need to be thinking 30 years in the future in terms of what do we expect to be breeding for, not just what are we breeding for now. And that's where modeling particularly can help. And then nutritional density. I mean, we have a problem with non-communicable diseases that to some extent relates more to the way the food is processed and presented than it does to the ingredients that go into the food. But it is true that many of those ingredients are carbohydrate rich. We need a lot more diversity and a lot more concentrated nutrition in our agricultural system. And part of that is diversity by different crops, not simply we fortify crops, which is perfectly reasonable to do. We need more crops, and that crop diversity will also have an effect. And it's interesting, FAO is now starting to measure dietary diversity seriously, rather than saying, well, we can always have vitamin tablets or we can have biofortification. Dietary diversity in the end is what you need. The problem is getting it into a system that works in a particular location. So I think a lot of those solutions will be fairly specific in terms of where they work and where they don't. Rather than having this green revolution monoculture paradigm of this is how you do it, I think there'll be lots and lots of different approaches, and different ones will work in different places. And that means what we can't do in a sense is we can't, as scientists, we can't solve all of those because there isn't enough money and there aren't enough scientists. That means we really need to be thinking about how we learn more generic lessons that allow development organizations or farmers themselves to develop the system that works. VAX is an interesting one because it has focused on nutrition. It's obviously very unfortunate that USAID and the State Department effectively pulled out from that one. But I'm hoping it will still continue because I think many of the other funders do see that as being an important step forward in terms of diversification. And I think that's probably it in terms of what I was looking to say. So just coming back to the overall title, Boosting Holistic Agriculture Through Research, Awareness and Training. I think there are lots of questions there in terms of what is holistic agriculture. And I don't think there's a single answer. So I think there's a danger, scientists, of getting really caught up in this question of, oh, well, what is resilient? What is regenerative agriculture? Is it the same as inorganic? Is it the same as X, Y, Z? And I think what we really need to be thinking about is what are the key components of a sustainable, nutritious system that has some resilience to climate change. And I think if we can look at it more broadly rather than arguing single cases, it may be easier to find out how we design those sorts of things for a particular region. Okay, thank you.
Participants, if you have any query related to this PPT, you may ask. 5 to 10 minutes doubt clearing session.
Good evening, Marcel. I'm Surekha.
Hi.
And I have a doubt regarding one thing is how can research local women, and I'm an entrepreneur from India, okay, and how can research, local women entrepreneurs, and public nutrition programs collaborate through WACS can transform these climate resilient crops from underutilized resources into mainstream and market driven nutrition solutions?
Yes, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, I think what I would say is I think that that is what needs to happen. It's very,
And to make it little easy for
sorry.
you, probably I'll put it in another way. I'll make it a little easy for you so that probably, are there any opportunities for startups to co-develop consumer-ready nutritionist food products using these climate-resilient crops? Can WACS provide us data and partnership support for product validation and scaling?
I think that's part of what I'm hoping that's part of what WACS will be trying to do. I certainly there are a number of projects around the world. There's a periodic table of food is one of the projects that's being produced, which basically is looking at the nutritional content, both of crops, but also of food made from crops. There's also Forgotten Foods, which is an initiative very much focused on trying to capture or work with farmers to identify the knowledge that exists. I think my feeling, having sort of been involved in some of these areas for the last nearly 30 years, I guess, my feeling is that this sort of thing really needs to work through networks. Because I think the problem is simply that to get the critical mass of people from all of the disciplines and all of the things fully aligned and working together is pretty rare because it's expensive to do that. But I think a more informal system, so like as I was suggesting with the Bambara groundnut stuff, is if we have, somebody who's willing to host a website, an information site for 10 years or 20 years, then it helps to bring together a community of people who are interested and who want to be involved. And I mean, I have only really spoken about genetics end of things, but I think the social economics and all of these things are absolutely critical, and should be leading in many cases where the research is going, because I think with breeders there is a tendency to breed, and it's not necessarily a wrong thing, but it doesn't always take into account what the objective is in terms of what people want. And I think that is I can understand why it's like that, but I can also think it's difficult. Because in a sense, what you want is the breeder to do the breeding, but you want the social economics to do the focusing of the breeding in collaboration with the breeder.
Right.
And that's going across disciplines, and that's difficult. I mean, even in UK, it is difficult to get people to work together on a very even platform. And obviously there's obviously some degree of prejudice amongst maybe lab scientists in terms of what social economic scientists do, because they don't understand what they do, basically. And I think that the key thing is to come to these networks with an acceptance that everybody has a valid point of view, and that valid point of view is going to contribute in terms of trying to resolve a problem.
Next, please. Next, please.
Thank you so much.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir. Myself, Amaresh from India.
Right.
So that Bambara groundnut is very rich in carbohydrates and proteins and fiber, but it's not having proper awareness in India and all. May I know the reason, sir?
I mean, it's the composition is quite similar to chickpea in terms of the composition overall. It's a new crop. It's a new crop. I mean, the first time it was introduced into India was the BAMLink project in 2007. And it was it was introduced into research institutes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
The recent work that's been done with the National Gene Bank has introduced large numbers of inbred lines, and that will be able to feed into the ACRIP system or a similar system. So I mean, the person I've spoken to at National Gene Bank is fairly convinced it's going to be a crop that's going to be used in India.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir.
Next, please.
So one more doubt is, generally we consider groundnut is for oil content. May I know the percentage of oil content in Bambara groundnut?
It's very small. So it's effectively, I mean, it's a Vigna. So effectively it's a bean. But morphologically, it's quite similar to groundnut, but it isn't that closely related to groundnut. Where it has an advantage over groundnut is it is more drought tolerant, but it's not equivalent.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Next participants, please. Nandini, please check chat box.
Yeah, sir, there are some questions like I want to study environmental science abroad. So what is the process?
I think this question is not related to PPT or subject matter.
Yeah.
So kindly skip such type of questions. Any valid question related to the PPT or subject matter you may ask.
No, sir.
Like one question is there any fellowship for PhD in molecular seed pathology in University of Nottingham?
Not at this point in time. There is a DTP system which recruits every year, so you could look at that one. And I think they recruit a third of their students from overseas. So that might be worth looking at. What I suspect won't be the case is it won't be a full, I mean, it might be a full fee scholarship, but it won't be a support fellowship, I suspect. But have a look it's on the website for Nottingham. And they're going to start recruiting quite soon, I think. So it would be worth having a look to see what the options are.
Sir, some participants are asking for your presentation. If there is no any issue, can you please share me?
Yes, that's fine. Yes, no problem.
Okay, sure. Okay. Anybody else, please? Nandini. Nandini, are you getting my
Yes,
voice?
sir. Yes, sir. There is no questions. So, on the behalf of AgriMeet Foundation Bharat and UGC MMTTC Jodhpur, we extend a warm welcome to Dr. Sean Mays to the Day 18 of Bharat 2025. We look forward to your insights on building faster, data-driven breeding pipelines and partnerships that translate genetics and genomics into farmer-centric outcomes. Your emphasis on speed, accuracy, and delivery has given our participants practical frameworks to strengthen their own breeding and research programs. Thank you so much, sir. We are very much grateful for your presence. Please be connected for any future academic activities.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak to people.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And looking forward to your support in future academic activities.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, sir. Good night,
Okay,
sir.
good evening. Yes.
Okay.